So, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Today I'm talking to Ray Wang, who leads the memory analysis team at SemiAnalysis. My name is Yuri Khodjamirian. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Tema ETFs. We are working in a research partnership together with SemiAnalysis on one of our ETFs, DISC, which is the Tema Memory ETF, ticker DISK. I'm really pleased to have Ray with me today, and we're going to be talking about CXMT and the outlook for memory. So, Ray, thanks for joining me. Really, CXMT is a very interesting company. It has very interesting history. Maybe for the people listening who are unfamiliar with CXMT, the kind of leading Chinese DRAM company, do you mind telling us a little bit about how it emerged as a credible force in DRAM over the last couple of years? One of the most difficult semiconductor markets to tackle.
Yeah, hey, Yuri, thanks for having me. I think it always go back to like roughly 2016, right, when the company being established, and back then the founder was actually have a lot of academic background, actually studying U.S. on engineering, and he came back to China and for a bunch of talent to form a company. And initially, I think the company wasn't that prepared in terms of like doing DRAM. I think it takes a lot of time for like domestic R&D, a lot of I would say the IP acquisition, technology acquisitions to like other I would say other smaller companies or back then was mid-sized companies, right? And essentially they sort of have that DRAM technology fundamentals and they gradually advance from there. And I will say it's actually quite impressive in terms of like how the company has grown to sort of a fourth biggest memory supplier in the world. Because to achieve that in roughly, let's say, I would say 8 years, right? I think 2024 is pretty clear that they are like number four player, right? Or even earlier than that. It's very, very impressive because DRAM is an industry that has been here for multiple decades. And to really surpass a lot of your sort of precedents is very, very difficult. And I think to stand where they are is to allow for talent, allow for research efforts, and sometimes some strategic acquisition or sometimes a more aggressive acquisition, right? Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, when I was reading about the history, it was kind of very focused on the founder, his previous company, Giga Device as well, and also just the technology transfer, the engineering. It was a kind of clear
Yeah.
moment where other people were giving up on DRAM and China was investing heavily in it. And also there was that part of the state capital, which I think is a big part of the story. This is a company that's supported by the Chinese ecosystem. But one of the things when I was reading about the company and we were researching it for our fund, and for those listening, this is a holding within Disc. We acquired it on the day of the IPO. There was an element about the technology that they're using, right? That basically the market's view is that CXMT is behind SK Hynix, Samsung, Micron in terms of the technology. Where do you kind of compare their technology roadmaps and technology position today? What are some of the important gaps that are missing? And there's a narrative clearly out there in the market today right now that China is catching up in many of these areas. I'd love to hear your view on it.
I think we can separate to two part, right? One part you have a conventional DRAM, another one you have HBM. I think start on conventional DRAM. I will say, just in terms of the, conventional DRAM we can separate to consumer and also server. I will say consumer, you can actually see material adoptions, right? For CSMT's LPDDR across China. And in some cases, you can actually find them in some of the foreign brands, consumer products that sold in China, right? So I think on that, I think there's less concerns regarding like, whether they have good enough quality to be on the market, right? I think that on that part it's quite clear. And if you look at CSMT's revenue structure, still majority of the revenue is driven by LPDDR products. And I think we can talk a little more on how they have improved along the way on the server DRAM. Server DRAM, I think remember in 2024 or even 2025, it's still quite a challenge for the company and to really go through sort of the ODM's qualification and pass essentially the end customer, which is essentially the Chinese or US CSP's qualification, right? I would say on US part right now it's still quite difficult, but in Chinese CSP they are definitely picking up on traction. And over the past 2 years, I think your server DRAM product has gradually improved, whether it's on the manufacturing side and or on the qualification side. On top of that, we are in a very supply constrained environment, both in China and in the world. In that sense, for TSMT to having a product and having the capacity to supply the market is extremely important, and it's exactly what the market need. And that's why they have continued to sort of increase their shipment. I would say over the past 2 years, and over the past roughly half a year or so. Actually, not only they are increase the shipment, but also significantly increase the profitability, right? Which we kind of lay out in our latest CSMT newsletter and previous institutional post. Lastly, I think we can talk about a little bit on HBM. I will say they are still quite lagging behind on the HBM efforts for a few reasons. One, I think front end, they are still a couple generations behind versus the leading player. On top of that, HBM is a very complex technology that the die size of the core DRAM die is bigger, and it require TSV, require downing, require backend packaging, and more manufacturing process complexity. So I think that will take some time for CSMT to really figure out. I will say the front end challenges is a little bit more than the back end because I think back end China, if you look at their OSATs, right, China is actually, I would say top three packaging country in the world, right, behind Taiwan and maybe some other ones company that located across the globe, right? So I think HBN essentially the future roadmap will come out to a couple things, right? Whether CSMT can continue to advance their advanced process node, moving from right now it's roughly 1Y1Z equivalent to like 1A 1B, right? And then similarly for the conventional DRAM will be like, hey, uh, due to the fact that they are lack of EUV, how can they scale the DRAM beyond the 1Y, 1Z equivalent now to 1A, 1B eventually, right? One thing I think they are trying to do is to focus on 3D DRAM in the next 2 to 3 years, and we'll see how they're gonna place out. And that's certainly quite a different roadmap, roadmap compared to the three major memory makers, which are going to pursue more advanced stuff from 1C and in the future 1D. Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense. I think, reading some of the research you guys have produced and some of the work that we've done, it feels like it's a company that's in the right moment, right? Even though it's behind in some of the technologies, there's this insatiable demand domestically and also abroad for these products. And so, what you guys were saying, like every HBM wafer they're going to produce, even if it's not at the most leading edge, is probably going to be consumed at home, right? Because it's going to be used by the domestic CSPs and it's going to be used by, Alibaba, all these companies as well.
Yeah.
And one of the key things that you mentioned is capacity, right? And that I think is really important. And one of the things that I think the market is looking at right now is CXMT's expanding capacity aggressively, right? And so how large do you think it could become in the next couple of years in terms of market share? I mean, give people a sense of where we are now, where are we headed? Because I think people underestimate maybe how big this player could be.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to think about it. On the capacity, so I think we can think about wafer, we can think about shipment, right? And essentially we can kind of talk about market share. I think start on wafer capacity. I think by 2030 for CSMT, we are looking at more than 800K wafer start per month by 2030. That's on the overall wafer capacity part. In terms of the bit shipment, I think there's a chance that by 2030 they can get more than 20% bit shipment, or there probably will be high teens, right? It would depend on like how fast others are growing. Assuming everyone's growing similar speed, right? I think CSMT will probably be like high teens market share, which compared to like right now probably low teens market share today. So definitely, I think there's a chance they can grow more. I think one of the key data here is like how fast the capacity CSMT is growing in terms of bits compared to like how fast the three major players are adding capacity in bits, right? So what I will say, I think like over 20%, maybe, it could be like a sort of upside cases. But I would say the basic cases will be like roughly, let's say, mid-teens market share. I think will be fair because everyone especially starting from 28, everyone gonna add a lot of capacity, not just CSMT. On top of that, I think what people not discuss more besides CSMT is like beside the 800K by 2030 from CSMT, you also have SwissShare slash Huawei, and you also have um the YMTC also gonna adding DRAM capacity. So all three players together, they're probably gonna end up somewhere like definitely more than 900K and maybe somewhere around like 1 million wafer start per month by the end of 2030. So that's quite material. Yeah, for the whole like DRAM market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what would be really helpful maybe for people is, and certainly for us, one of the things that we think you guys are great at doing is looking at the overall memory market, right? So you have this expansion from CXMT, as you say, it's expansion from some of the other Chinese players, but also the players in the US and Korea. So if you, as you're kind of looking through your latest memory model, and I know you've updated it, how does this expansion affect the DRAM supply picture, demand, pricing? I mean, basically, do you guys think the market is going to be remain undersupplied for some time as these capacity additions come in? I just love your view as to like, okay, when is the market going to become, maybe oversupplied? What is the outlook? And how's that outlook maybe different from the rest of the market?
Yeah, I think it's very debatable and sort of the challenging outlook to really forecast, right? Because especially over, I will say like the 28 to 2030 time frame, it's a kind of like one, you don't know the capacity, how much you're gonna add, how much you're gonna allocate for HBM. On the demand end, it sort of have the last visibility in terms of like how the server market gonna grow, how the HBM market gonna grow, right? Sure, we can have sort of a we'll do our best to having a better estimate, but I think the sort of the visibility there is not as clear as 26 and 27 because I think for both 26 and 27, I will say all the DRAM sold out, both HBM and conventional DRAM. I would even argue that the HBM in 28 should also going to sold out, right? But I think essentially in terms of supply demand, I think how and in how CSMT impacted, I will say you know, if you just look at like the pure wafer capacity, people should assume that the capacity of CSMT should easily cause oversupply, right? Because they are adding like 100K, 150K every single year, or adding even more than that, right? And the implied bits of that should be significant, particularly given the size is getting bigger as well. But I think what people didn't realize is like how much of that capacity are being allocated to HBM. I think to our understanding, the incremental capacity for CSMT in the future, 40 to 50% of that will be allocated for HBM. And this is driven by a couple of things, right? One, China has been HBM constrained for a long time, and which they are going to even more in the future. Two, I think we're gonna see more domestic Chinese AI accelerator shipment that require HBM, right? So both things will drive a lot of HBM domestic in China, and because of the export control won't allow the imports of foreign HBM, you essentially need to rely on one player, which is CSMT. So I think that make a lot of sense to me. So assuming that's the case, and that's actually what is going to happen in the next 3 to 4 years, that will significantly enroll how much bit shipment that CSMT can really add into the market. So I think essentially, similar thing happening in for Samsung, Micron, and Hynix, right? So we think like 27 should have probably the worst shortage. 28 will be a little bit better. I think 29 and 2030 are more a time frame that we should see more material improvement, even though we might still be under supply, given like how much we have been under supply in 27, 26, 27, 28, right? Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's sort of our house view for now.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because that I think is somewhat different, certainly to the current some narratives in the marketplace, which are saying, CXMT is building excessive capacity, going to flood the market. I think the things that are underappreciating is probably the domestic demand picture, right? These accelerators building at home and the HBM piece. One of the things that's been a real evidence that HBM is difficult to do, but it also consumes a lot of wafers, right? And it's taking supply away from the DRAM market.
Yeah, I
Just
will say, one
yeah.
more point. I would say, like besides sort of like the marketing condition, right? I think one important thing when we think about CSMT, the strategic planning of the company, there's also another layer of consideration regarding like CSMT as a key memory company or a key hardware company in China, right? If compute is such important resources, you want to make sure your own country has the ability to build that. So there's also a government's push in terms of building more HBM capacity as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I think has been a topical thing right now because of the information article about China, starting to build DUV machines. One of the things that we were wondering is obviously I think China's going to be restricted in terms of its access to leading edge EUV lithography tools, right? And how much of a constraint do you think equipment, as in semiconductor equipment, technologies, basically related to advanced memory manufacturing? I know EUV comes in a bit later into the DRAM pipelines. How much of a restriction is there? I mean, is that a problem, or are we kind of past that point?
Oh, I think DUV continue to be I will say the most important equipment resources for both the DRAM and the NAND player in China. I think we see the news that China starting having some domestic DUV shipment, but I think it will still take time to prove that whether that is production ready, whether
Mm,
that can really having a large scale production for both DRAM and maybe NAND as well. So I think for now, I will sort of wait and see. And based on our conversation with industry players, our research, we continue to find that ASML as a lithography player on the DUV front continue to be the most important equipment company in China,
mm,
especially for the DRAM and NAND player, because both company will require a lot of DUV tool for the company. And if you look at SML, their comments regarding their China outlook, right? I think they are actually revised up their China outlook the most recently, and
yeah.
it seems the outlook there should be better, not lot better than people think because on one hand you have a lot of memory build in both DRAM and NAND. On the other hand, I think the sort of logic front in sorry the legacy logic front build out is also very, very strong, driven by SMIC and Hua Hong, right?
Mm.
So in that sense, I think I would say lithography continue to be sort of a very important bottleneck that China will need to overcome. So that's on the DUV front. I will say EUV, they are still have quite some distance to go. I
Yeah.
think the gap there is definitely much bigger. Bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we see as well, ASML is producing like hundreds of DUV machines, selling them to China, servicing them, the information flow that goes in there. It's a long time before these things can get up to speed. If we switch tack for a second, I think one of the things that will be really beneficial for certainly investors in our fund is just understanding the Chinese AI infrastructure build out, because I think there's not as much visibility into that as there is into Google, Microsoft, everyone's CapEx and the neo clouds and maybe even some of the sovereigns. How rapidly is China's cloud and technology companies, like how much are they investing? Are they making big purchasing commitments for memory for CXMT? And how does that compare to maybe the West? So it's just people get a sense of the scale of what's going on in terms of the hyperscalers in China.
Oh, yeah, I mean, on a high level, it's just to get like the compute capex, right? The sheer amount of the US hyperscaler, the sort of the difference of the sheer amount of the US hyperscalers and Chinese hyperscalers, is very, very large, right? I don't think it's really comparable, to be honest. And it's purely by like company size, the capex size. I don't think it's really comparable. But I think the better way to look at it is like how much the capex has been increasing for all these major CSP in China, right? Look at Alibaba, ByteDance, Tencent, Baidu, right? Look at like how much capex they are spending on compute, and most recently memory, right? I think the growth there is very significant. While I don't have the number in my head, but I think you can just look at their capex outlook from 1Q24, let's say, to the most recent quarter, right? At least to my understanding, in the past few quarters, they continue to revise up the capex still, right? And that should suggest two things, right? One, they continue to see the great potential for the ROI of AI compute. On top of that, they also see the necessary to invest in compute plus memory. And based on our understanding, I think Chinese CSP has signed multiple LTAs with CXMT. In particular, they are trying to secure server DRAM capacity and less so HBM capacity as well, right? So I think it's quite clear to me that not only the Chinese players are having awareness to so not only like US players are doing their best to secure as many memory as they can. Same goes to US, same goes to Chinese CSP. Not only secure the Chinese memory, but also the foreign memory as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the reasons we've invested in CXMT in disk is because this kind of misconception, right? Like that there is this domestic demand. It's growing faster than people realize. There's a need for this kind of compute, and compute is essentially sold out. And one of the other elements that, what we've described here is that that creates a tightness of supply versus demand and is pushing prices up. And one of the things that the other misconception that I think the market hasn't understood about CXMT is about pricing, right? So people often see CXMT as the kind of cheaper alternative than Korean US memory products. And I think some of the great work that you guys have done looking at ASPs, and I'd love you to talk about it. That framing just seems incomplete to me. What do you think investors are getting wrong there in your analysis? Like, it's not really the cheap
Yeah.
player, is it?
Yeah, I think there's couple of things I think it's people are misunderstood, right? I think you can make the argument that in the past, CSMT are actually having a cheaper memory. Because I think back in the days, right, like on one hand, their quality was materially behind, and they are actually making more legacy memory. And then if you are making DDR4, the capacity there was actually even more easily being impacted because the total sheer size of the total capacity in legacy memory it's much easier, right? Let's say you have total 100K and then you just add 20K, right? The impact will definitely be much bigger when you are adding 50K within like 500K capacity, right? I think that's one thing. Two, I think again, I think, we can continue to mention the constraint part, right? If we are in a such supply constraint situation. And in China, you can actually assume even more constraint, right? Because a tons of memory demand are going to US hyperscalers, going to neoclouds, going to maybe company like NVIDIA, AMD who are buying HBM. That actually squeezing out more memory volume that can allocate it to China. So China is facing a situation that one, they want as much as memory they can, but the amount of the memory they can get compared to before is actually less. So the only way they can do is like trying their best to secure DRAM in China. And if you are CSMT, you are a supplier, of course you are aware of that, right? There are two things you can do in commodity DRAM. You can easily sell your memory same price as lot of your supplier or similar price, and that's sort of the industry standard. But in sort of Chinese market, I think CSMC are definitely seeing some opportunity that at some point we are either selling in similar or a little lower pricing. In some cases, we can actually sell more expensive pricing given how the supply demand works for each product segment. I think that's actually what's happening right now. On HBM, it's even more constrained, right? So like you can actually, we heard some anecdotes that they are actually selling HBM at a higher pricing versus the US players. So I mean, even though that could be just some anecdotes, but I think some of all this data point, if you put together, it actually make a lot of sense. Essentially, I think it's about the supply demand and whether you can have enough memory, right? And I think another one important priority, I think, or sort of important point is like, I don't think at this point well, surely people are cost aware, but if you couldn't get enough DRAM, you either could not deploy your compute or you couldn't sell your products, right? So you want
Mm.
to address both things first.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is
Yeah.
what I'm hearing as well, right? The cost of GPUs, the cost of the compute, the ROI people are getting is it's substantial, right? So like you will pay up for the DRAM even if the price is higher because that is what is going to deliver those models and that ROI as well. I mean, look, we really like the CXMT story, and one of the reasons we added CXMT to the Tema memory ETF disk, kind of on the first day of trading, is look, we've got this active management approach, and we want to invest where there's misconception and where the most interesting developments are occurring. So, if we think about beyond the IPO, which just happened this week, what are some of the key milestones investors should be thinking about in the next kind of 12 to 24 months? What's next for this company? What's key to watch out for?
Yeah, I think it's not just for CSMT actually. I think what investor right now maybe pay the most attention are two things, right? One is what's the pricing upside for coming quarter? What's the what's the catalyst, right? And so pricing there, so you can separate the two things, right? For second half this year, how much conventional DRAM can grow in terms of pricing for Q3 and Q4, particularly when you have more DRAM LTA or NAND LTA in the future that coming in, right? When more LTA coming in, what's the pricing upside there for 3Q and 4Q? I think that's one thing that people really care. On top of that, you also have the HBM pricing that should grow materially next year. Right now, I think both memory supplier and the customer has a consensus that, hey, your commodity DRAM is already like over 80% margin, but your HBM maybe only 50 to 60% margin. But HBM was so much harder to make in terms of its theory intensity, manufacturing complexity. So there's a consensus that the margin of the two has to converge next year. We don't know whether it's gonna completely on parallel, but we know it's gonna converge materially. So average HBM pricing next year, we should see material price hike, I think, among the all memory supplier, but in particular, the three major memory supplier that supply the most HBM next year. I think those on the pricing front. The next things I will say, I think also very, very important is on the sustainability. I will say like, all this LTA, all this pricing upside is great. Essentially will decide the ceiling of how much memory can really go, whether it's on the company's valuation in terms of multiples or in terms of like company's EPS in the 2, 3 years time frame. It's about whether they can sustain the current sustainability of the current pricing or current earnings trajectory. To do that, I think investors really need to see more demand visibility to make them believe
Hmm.
this is sort of the loan that they can really buy into, right? So I think those are the couple of things that people are really focused on right now.
That's interesting. And so I think that that's quite well put because you're basically placing CXMT, which is an interesting company, into the broader ecosystem of memory, right? It's an important player. It's number four. It has potential to gain a lot of market share over time and establish its position, even if it means serving the Chinese market and a lot of it happening through import and export substitution, as you say. How are you thinking about the valuation of CXMT, right? Obviously, it's had this big pop on the IPO relative to its technology growth potential, capacity ambitions, established global competitors. Do you think it kind of deserves the valuation that it's got currently going out into the future as a sort of catch-up play, if you will?
Yeah, I think it's a little hard for me to comment on the company's valuation, honestly, especially CSMT. I think it's very tricky because, like, I think typically for the DM player, you are trading at like the single, you are trading at like 5 times, right? My company's a little higher, 7 times, 8 times. Hard for me to say like, hey, 10 times or 12 times where CSMT should be traded at, right? I think it's really hard to say. Well, I think it will take some time for investors to really figure out. But I think if you want to make the case that the CSMT should be traded at materially premium versus the other three memory players, I think I need to see more evidence and a more strong reasoning behind that, right? Whether it's competitiveness, whether they are really gaining market share, or
Hmm.
are they making actually better DRAM or HBM, right? I think those are a couple of things I would really think about. I also understand that geographically, sometimes the stock being listed in different market will have different multiples or sometimes
Absolutely.
different multiples premium. But I think for now, I think it's very hard for me to give like the exact answer that, hey, this is a stock actually being traded 50 times or 15 times or 10 times, right? I think it's a little early to say. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, with this, we think it's a really interesting company which has a lot of catch-up potential. So there's like plenty of options for it to make up that gap, which explains some of the premium valuation it's trading on. But you're right, it's market discovery. We need to figure it out. It is a very unique asset because it serves a captive market effectively, and it's also supported by that captive market, and that has some geopolitical value as well. Just
Yeah.
as a final question, look,
Yeah.
investors I'm seeing out there. Currently, memory stocks are under pressure in the market right now. What's your kind of view overall? Like everything we've talked about here suggests an undersupplied market into 2028, potentially even to 2030, HBM becoming a really complicated piece of technology to produce, and margins are going to start to go up. It's a consolidated market, even with this capacity being added, is absorbed in the Chinese market as far as I can see, AI returns and ROI, they continue to be there. What's your kind of view in this, I guess, storm that's out there right now?
Yeah, I think this month is definitely very, very tough. I think for all the investors that in both DRAM and NAND, right? I think there's no doubt about it. I think there's just so many elements, right? There's like a technical trade elements that play in there. I think remember late. I think and we are actually having a really, really good first half, right? From a stock performance perspective. On top of that, I think for the memory stock, it's a very, very crowded trade. It's maybe less crowded over the past week, but it was, maybe like I would say late June, right? there's so much margin calls, so much leverage, so crowded trade that both retail and institutional investor are locking in, right? And I think that creates sort of a scenario that like you at some point you're gonna see significant deleverage, reduction of the margin calls. Some people are taking profits, right? People are trimming position to manage the volatility. On top of that, locally in Korea or globally, we also see a lot of memory related ETF, or I will say more importantly, the lowest leverage ETF that
Mm.
really impacts the market. I think that's sort of on the trade or kind of stock front or investment
The
part.
technical side, yeah.
Yes. And then I think on top of that, we have sort of, I would say, macro concern, right? Of course, I'm not a macro expert. Of course, we have the sort of geopolitical instability. I think what's more important here for the memory stock is actually two things. One on tokens, two on the open source model, right? People are worried, hey, is the hyperscale can really spend that much capex to support a compute? Is the ROI still there, right? I believe both things can be true. I think hyperscalers should continue to increase their capex, and real ROI is actually there. If I look at one good indicator is the AI and ARR number of OpenAI and Anthropic in the first half this year, right? And the Codex was actually doing really, really well over the roughly past month.
Mm.
In terms of all those compute financing concern, I think I continue to see that compute to be a viable options. And then if the company continues to see ROI of the compute, I don't have much concerns on that. Lastly, I think I will talk about, oh, sorry, one more thing on the open source AI. I think people are sort of really worried about this like open source AI model from China. I think it's true that in some way, on the pricing front, some people will argue it's more affordable, right? But like if you really look at like the sort of the pricing or like pricing of the Kimi model or how much money you need to train and inference the model, right? It's really not necessarily cheaper. And then if you look at like how the model has grown, right? The sort of some of the scaling continue to make memory very important. One, we continue to see the model size become bigger and bigger, right? Right now we are at 2.8 trillion, and that which is
Right.
similarly like you have Fable 5.6 also in trillion level models, right? So continue to show that when you scale the model size, you continue to get a material performance gain. When you continue to scale the model size, I don't want to get into too much detail, but essentially you need more HBM and need more DRAM. And so if that's the case, right, the scaling will continue to send. I think another thing is sort of a last right? Like when you look at like the cost per token was continuing to going down significantly, and the usage of token was growing continuous significantly, right? And that should be another data point to take when we think about the whole AI model training and inferencing and the memory demand moving forward. So I continue to see all this scaling continue to host it. I think that's like on the fundamental part. I don't really think like there's like a material improve or material like change in terms of like the memory
Yeah.
company's fundamental, right? I think that on that part, I think investors are quite aware. People try to looking really, really hard on each data point in memory company's fundamental. But I don't really think there's a sort of a major change that happened, I'll say, over the past a month or two. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think that's sort of my general view. It's a complex
Yeah.
topic, but yeah.
It's very interesting as a situation. And j just to wrap up, you have this technical picture, over leverage, stretch positioning, and that's being worn out in the market. But everything that we see in the fundamentals, and especially if you look at emerging companies like CXMT, they seem to continue to build out into a very undersupplied market. The fundamentals of AI continue to be strong. So we see that as well. We have yet to see any data point that suggests that it's going the other way. But the market, as you say, is very sensitive to all of these data points, and sentiment has certainly turned the other way, which could be for many investors long term an opportunity. Ray, I want to say a big thank you for taking us through CXMT. As mentioned, Ray is the lead analyst on the memory model and the memory team at SemiAnalysis, who support us at Tema ETFs, managing the Tema Memory ETF, ticker DISK. Thanks so much for your time.